Thank you, and welcome to the Cambridge Forum, discussing storytelling in the electronic age with Odds Botkin and Maria Tatar. I'm Sasha Helper, child psychiatrist and essayist. Nothing gets an audience's attention like those simple words, "Let me tell you a story." Telling stories is an ancient art, a holdover from the pre-literate human past. Stories passed on a culture's most important expressions and deepest spiritual values. Odds Botkin's character voice and music-filled storytelling style has been mesmerizing listeners for 24 years. Mr. Botkin taught at Antioch, New England Graduate School. He has been featured as a teller at the National Storytelling Festival. He's performed twice at the White House, and he's performed at Lincoln Center. Accompanying himself on the 12-string guitar, Celtic harp, piano, and other instruments, he's produced 17 award-winning audio recordings. I feel like I've known Odds for a very long time. When my family was young and we would have long drives, we would put in an Odds Botkin tape. The stories were so compelling that if we arrived at the end of our long journey, we would stay in the car until the story was over. Maria Tatar is the John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature at Harvard University. She teaches courses in the field of folklore and children's literature and in Germanic studies. She is author of 2 books of annotated folk stories, and most recently she has published Enchanted Hunters, The Power of Stories in Childhood. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Odds and Maria. I'm going to ask Odds to start by telling us a story.
Good evening. How are you all? Good? Yes, I'll use those words. Let me tell you a story. An old tale from Sweden. A poor Swedish farmer stood on his new farm. Right near where he stood rose the barn. Close to that, his new hut, and near it the cow shed where the cows slept at night. Now you would have thought that a poor farmer, having just been given a farm, would have been a happy man. But no, this farmer's heart was filled with woe and worry, because for 100 years, the farm he had just been commanded to work by the lord of the manor, who owned all the little farms, had had bad luck. As soon as you went out into his apple orchards in September to pick the apples, they would shrivel and fall to the ground. The pigs looked like sacks of bone and could give no pork or bacon or ham. The cows would groan, and into the buckets would squirt sour milk. And the fields would grow a blight, and all the wheat would die off to the earth. 100 families had tried to survive a harvest and a winter there in 100 years, but they had all been driven off by hunger. The farm would give no food. And so you can imagine when this poor farmer was told that he, with his wife and his 2 young children, was the 101st to be told to work the unlucky farm. He was worried. But he was a good-hearted fellow, and so as he stood on his farm on one summer day, he talked to it. You know, sometimes you talk to places when nobody's looking. And he said, "Well, der farm, I hope that you don't give bad luck. Yeah, to me and my family, like you give to all the other farmers who lived here. I do nothing to you, farm. Never have I been here in all my life." When all at once he heard something. The farmer jumped up and looked around. Hello? Hello? Who said that? Hello? But there was no one near him. Aye, what kind of a farm is this? Well, whoever you are, wherever you are, come calling, oh, next spring. If I'm alive, I'll be here. Well, for some reason, that autumn's harvest wasn't completely destroyed. There was one pig that grew fat enough for slaughter. There was one tree where all the apples did not rot, and they put away a bushel in the deep cellar beneath the planks of the kitchen. There was a cow that gave a few buckets of sweet milk, so the farmer's wife was able to put away some cheese and butter. And one small plot of his field did not grow the blight, and they milled off a bit of wheat. And so it looked as if this family didn't eat very much food each night, they would have enough food to last them the entire long Swedish winter. And soon winter came. And the blankets of snow wrapped around his house, but safe inside, he and his wife and his 2 children had enough to eat. And then Yuletide came, as it always does in the land of Sweden, and since they had a little left over and he needed them badly, his wife went out and bought her husband a new pair of boots. They were beautiful. They didn't have a smudge on them, no mud, no manure, no scratches. And he put them on and shoved them up close to his fire, and he realized that they twinkled in the light. And so he decided to wrap rags around his old boots, and instead, every night, keeping those boots perfect, he put them on, called them his supper boots, and watched them twinkle. Well, winter passed, and the world outside his door turned to mud. He threw great planks of oak in the ooze of the barnyard, and all seemed ordinary until one spring night, as he and his wife and his 2 children were about to have their supper, and all at once, the door blew open and slammed against the wall, and the children jumped up, and they ran and they hid behind their mother's skirt. For there, standing in the door, was a little man. He's about a foot tall, he's about a foot wide. And he walked in, and he said, "Well, how do you do? How do you do? Here I am. Come like you invited me, and here I am." The farmer looked and said, "Yeah, here you are. Who are you?" "Who am I? Who am I? I'm the elf of your farm. Who do you think I am?" "Oh, of course you are. Yeah, well, come in. It's cold. Come in, come in." And the little man pointed to the door and closed by itself. "You're the first farmer to invite me up here in 100 years, and I've got a gift for you. But first, I'm hungry." And the farmer said, "Oh, that's very lucky. We're about to have supper. You want to stay for supper?" "Thank you very much, thank you very much." And the little man jumped up onto the bench there by the table and began to point at the food and said, "What's that there? What's that?" "Oh, that's the boiled pork." "Yeah, you want a piece of the boiled pork?" "Thank you very much," said the little man. But instead of taking a slice, as any polite guest will do, the little man took the entire piece for the family's supper and pushed it into his mouth. He's a hungry little man. "My lord, do we have any more of that pork?" No. Oh, no. But by then the little man had stood further down and said, "And what's that there? What's that?" "Well, that's the loaf of bread for the whole family." "You want some of that?" "Thank you very much," said the little man, and he took the entire loaf and shoved it into his mouth. He's a very hungry little man. "My lord, do we have any more of that bread?" No. What are we going to eat? I don't know. When suddenly the little man shot toward the door, and it opened up, and in poured the cool spring night air, and the little man flew out into the barnyard. The farmer ran to his door and stopped, and he could see the little man flying all around his barnyard. Well, the farmer said, "Little man," and the little man floated up to him and said, "Come with me. What, we are going to my cave." And suddenly, the farmer realized it was his farm's elf. Mortals never saw them, and yet each farmer in Sweden knew that beneath his farmstead somewhere one lived, a small magical person who came up at night, moved hay about the barn, and made things grow. And this apparently was his. "Oh, yeah, we're going to your cave. Oh, no." He looked down and realized he was wearing his supper boots. "Oh, little man, I'm wearing my supper boots. I'm going to put on my ordinary work boots." No. Come now." Oh, no, you don't understand. These are my supper boots. It's muddy out there, and there's manure. No, this is more important than your boots. Follow me, farmer. But little man, farmer! Yeah, I'm coming. So the man reluctantly stepped out onto one of the planks, and it sank into the ooze, and some of the mud ran up along the edges and almost touched the toes of his prized boots, but didn't. And the little man flew across the barnyard until he hovered right in front of the cow shed where the cows slept at night. And to his dismay, the farmer saw great billows of manure steam pouring out into the cool night air. Little man, I know you don't want to go in there, do you? In here, this way! And the little man floated into the cow shed doors. But little man, these are my good boots. They'll never be the same. The little man floated out. This is more important than your boots. Yeah, I'm coming then. Oh, goodbye. Oh, yay. Oh, no. Oh, that was a fresh one, that one. And very unhappily, he walked into the cow shed and he followed the little man down the long row of cow rumps until he saw that the little man had stopped at a tiny hole in the mud. It looked to be the burrow of a mouse or a vole, perhaps. Here we are. Here's the door to my cave. I don't think I can fit down that door. Little man, even you... No. It's a magic door. You put your toe in it. And the little man put his tiny toe near the mud and he vanished. Are you down there? You're down there. I'm coming then. And down he flew. And he found himself quite unhurt in a tiny cave. Little roots hung from the ceiling just above his head. A fire crackled away in the corner, but strangely it made no smoke. There was a little table, a little chair, cups and plates. And standing in the midst of all of it was his farm's elf, who said, "Well, mortal, welcome to my cave." "Yeah, thank you very much. You know, I never knew this cave was under here, right under the cows." No one else does either, no. You sit there, I've got a gift for you." "Oh, yeah, the gift. I forgot about the gift. You know, that is some door." Farmer, just listen. Oh, I'm sorry, what do I do?" "Close your eyes, put out your hands." I have to do it. Close your eyes, put out your hands. I'm going to do that. The farmer closed his eyes and he put out his hands and he felt something warm in a bowl placed in them. He opened his eyes and he looked. And all it was a bowl of porridge. He didn't know quite what that meant and asked, "Porridge? This my gift?" "Do you like porridge, farmer?" "My favorite." Yeah, well, thank you very much. Happy spring. You ate my supper, I'll eat your porridge. Have you got a spoon? The little man gave him a spoon, but just as he was about to dip his spoon into the porridge, something dripped into it. What was that? What's something dripping in here? Yay, what is that? What's dripping from the ceiling up in there? Yay, what is that? No. Now, little man, do you know that you've got manure dripping from your ceiling? And the little man looked at him and said, "That's right, dripping from my ceiling. Dripping on me table, dripping on me bread. And if I'm not careful when I walk in here, it drips on my head. Now, you listen to me, I've been living in this cave for 581 years, longer than you'll ever live. And I took good care of the farm up above until 100 years ago a farmer came along and put the new cow shed right above my cave. Ever since then, it's been drip, drip, drip. I don't like it. I've been blighting the crops. I've been making the cattle go sour. I don't like manure in my porridge." The farmer looked at him and said, "Oh, that's a sad story." "Oh, wait a moment. Maybe this is a gift after all. Little man, you know, up there now, that's my farm. I put things where I want on my farm. what if as soon as the mud dries, yeah, I move it away? I'll clean up all the manure. I'll rebuild the building off in the West Field so that it no longer come in dripping in your home anymore. Would that make you happy? Would it make all this bad luck go away? Well, the little man seemed to regard him and then said, agreed. Yeah, agreed. I think this is the best gift I have in my whole life. May I go and tell my wife? She's been so worried. May I go? Yeah, you may go. Yeah, how? Up there by the ladder. Yeah, I'm going to go there, little man. Just go, farmer. And the farmer put his foot on the ladder and up he flew and he landed, luckily feet down amongst the cows. But he didn't care about his fancy boots anymore. He went running out. He told his wife the good news. And true to his word, as soon as the mud dried, he moved the cowshed away. And, according to this old story from Sweden, from that day on, if you went out into his orchards in September to pick apples, they would swell up and grow glossy and fall to your hands. The pigs were the best in the district. The cows gave bucket upon bucket of milk, half of which was cream, some of which churned itself to butter. And the fields were golden, as far as you could see. So, if any of you kind folks from Cambridge ever move into a new place, doesn't matter if there's never been a place there before, take a moment to say hello to the earth it sits on when no one's looking, because you never know who might have been there before you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Odds. Thanks. Okay, and then we'll hear from Maria. Okay.
Well, there are storytellers, teachers, and enchanters. And Odds, you have been an enchanter tonight and a storyteller. And I'm afraid that leaves me as the teacher, which is my role this evening. It was just fabulous to hear you in person. And I'm reminded of how stories affect not just the brain and the heart, but also the spinal cord, that little spot in the spinal cord. So thank you for a magical story. This is an evening of storytelling, and I can't help but feel that the spirit of storytelling is not completely here, although maybe indeed Brother Blue, whom I think of on this occasion as I hear you, is with us tonight, and I just want to tip my hat and pay tribute to him. He was always such a supportive, warm, and welcoming presence on occasions like this, and we miss him terribly. I wanted to mention my experience, start with my experience of Stories of Love, which Sasha kindly sent to me, which I played in the car over the weekend. This is Odds telling the story of Dame Ragnell. Not a story that I knew, but I see some smiles of recognition. And I listened to this, not just the voice, but the sound effects, which you heard, the music. It's sort of that Wagnerian total work of art. And I am not a fan of audiobooks. So I worried, I want to love this, will I? And indeed I did. And it reminded me of how different the storytelling experience is from the audiobook. That is, this is, obviously more than it just comes alive. You brought the story alive for me. And I was particularly moved by it because I had been teaching Beauty and the Beast stories in my course on the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. And I had challenged the students to go out and find some stories, not Beauty and the Beast stories, but Handsome and the Beastess. That is, stories like the one about Dame Ragnell, where you have a very handsome hero and a loathly lady. And I'll just tantalize you. I can't answer the question for you because I don't want to give the story away, but the question is what do women want? And that question is answered in the course of this wonderful narrative. So thank you for that experience, for that enlivening experience. I want to talk about all kinds of different media, but I won't talk for too long because it will be wonderful to hear your questions and to talk about the presentation. But I wanted to mention that I bought a Kindle last week. I took the plunge. I decided I had to know what this was like. And the Kindle came in, the Kindle came in one box, and then the Kindle cover came in another box. Does anyone else here have a Kindle? Is anyone else reading with a Kindle? Or a Nook? I shouldn't just refer to Amazon. Well, in any case, if you buy one, you will pull the tab here. And unfortunately, I threw the tab away, but the words on the tab are "once upon a time." And it struck me as so extraordinary that here's this sophisticated instrument for reading, this piece of technology that is quite sophisticated, that then refers to oral storytelling, that tries to connect with oral storytelling, with the fairy tales of olden times. And then I was even more astonished when I opened this and got a definition of Kindle. And we get the transitive verb to set on fire, to inspire, stir up, and then the intransitive form of Kindle, which is to catch fire and become animated. So again, I think really trying to connect with the storytelling experience of once upon a time, how our ancestors told stories, and how the reading experience too animates you, lights you up. Although I don't think I quite see the kind of inspiration, that breath of inspiration, that animating force that we got from your story. One of the things I also noticed in reading with a Kindle is that the text disappears. So it's so different from the reading of a book where you sort of feel, just because the material presence of the book is still there, that you somehow have the story. Odds and I were talking about how different technologies rewire your brain. And I'm not sure that I'm completely happy with the way my brain got rewired as I was reading the Kindle. But I think today we have so many so-called delivery systems for stories. I hate that term, but it's one that we hear now all the time, these different sorts of delivery systems, and we get the flow of content across multiple media platforms. In other words, there are many different ways to access a story, and we've heard one tonight, and you have the electronic media at the other extreme. So we're living in this age of transition, and I say that being aware that every age is an age of transition in a way. If you go back to Plato, you discover that there's huge anxiety about print culture, about writing, not about print culture, but just about writing. And why? Because writing will destroy memory. That is, there are these great advantages to writing. It will help you memorize things. It will give you wisdom. But also, what is the downside? The teacher will disappear. And also, instead of internalizing things, you begin to rely on these little black marks on a page. You rely on things that are outside yourself. But I think what is really important about Plato's discussion is that he reminds us of the importance of an embodied presence. the teacher, the storyteller, the enchanter, and how that experience can become important to us. So there are ways in which, of course, the existence of many different media platforms has a democratizing effect. And there are many critics, like Henry Jenkins, for example, who will tell us about how all these different forms of new media create communities. They can be used to create communities. That is, it's not just top-down. It's not just corporations that have control of the media, but it's also bottom-up. Bottom-up being something like YouTube. What I worry about in that context is that there's such an emphasis on monetizing and on creating franchises and on branding things rather than creating community. So on an upbeat note, I'll just close by saying why I think there will always be storytellers. And first of all, human curiosity. We always want to get the story. Our curiosity is aroused with those words, once upon a time, or the reasonable facsimiles of once upon a time. And then we take those stories and we ferociously repeat them. We're always creating new versions, like the Beauty and the Beast story. I was so astonished by the fact that, it seems sometimes the storytellers were so prescient. And in certain ways, I think they got gender in ways that we still don't get today. That story reminded me of it, how the wisdom of the storytellers is always ahead of the culture in ways. And then the importance of the human presence, and I think here in this context, a rather unlikely association, but the giver in Lois Lowry's novel of that title, who is the keeper of cultural memory, and the last person who knows, who has knowledge, and who has wisdom. And I think that we always want to have multiple givers, not just one giver, but many givers who are passing on our cultural stories and giving us the wisdom of past ages. So I think we will open things up or Sasha, do you want to say something?
I'll sit here, and if you want to sit, we can have a discussion. Basically, when I think about your opening, it made me think about bedtime stories, and I mentioned to Odds, and you mentioned a bedtime story idea in an email, so I'll just tell the audience. I told Odds it's possible he's put millions of children to bed many nights, although he was unaware of it, because they had their parents plug his CD in as they were tucked into bed. It seems to me this is a bonus because they get to hear Odds Botkin and go to sleep. The downside is the parent may rush off to the kitchen to do the dishes. Maria mentioned to me that she can't imagine cuddling with a Kindle at bedtime or giving a child a Kindle to hold to read and go to sleep with. So I was just wondering about your thoughts about the electronic age and bedtime stories.
Oh, I think that there is no substitute for a parent curling up with a child and reading a story. There is absolutely no substitute. And I think I have a flash of guilt if I've played the role of coming between that bond. But then again, I was a parent, and I had 3 boys, and sometimes I was too exhausted to do much of anything, having told stories to audiences of children all day. And so was happy on occasion to have another storyteller. It was never me whose CDs we listened to, but we listened to other storytellers, the boys did when they sometimes went to bed. And sometimes I'd tell them long sagas starring themselves in badly hidden alter egos, which they really liked. But there's, I don't think, a substitute for that parental bond. What do you think?
Well, thank you for your willingness to admit that sometimes you were too exhausted to read or to tell a story. And so it's wonderful to have other options. But I completely, there's nothing like the contact zone created through a story. And certainly one would hope, yes, turn on or put that CD in and listen with your child, listen to the story. Because in that contact zone, when you're talking about the tale and about the perils and possibilities that it opens up, about its happily ever after, and how that can be refashioned or reshaped, that you really get a kind of closeness. As for the Kindle, I have to admit, I did sort of cuddle up with the, there was a way, it just feels slightly different, but it's rather like a book in many ways, so.
On my drive down today, I heard a piece on NPR that in another 2 years, there will be new readers that open up like a book, and you can actually pull the pages across with a touch screen. They seem to be working toward the book-like experience.
Right. I think the hope is that we can still keep the book. That is, there isn't a substitute for that experience. You know exactly where you are. And I think there's something to be said for the materiality of that. Usually, one of the things I love about storytelling is that you can make something from nothing. That is, it's just, obviously with you, it's also music and sound effects and all of that, but there's a beauty to that. And I remember my children always loved the stories that I made up. They always wanted to hear something that was, my own story, which then became their own story.
And Odds, I know you teach at St. Anselm's College, and you were teaching the Iliad, is that right?
I performed the Iliad Book 1 each year for the entire freshman class.
Okay. And was the goal of that a performance or for them to learn the Iliad?
Well, they're charged with reading the Iliad as freshmen there. And for a lot of modern young digital natives to delve into such dense epic poetry and to make sense of it is difficult. So my role is simply as a popularizer. I have an hour-long performance of the Iliad Book 1, the great argument between Agamemnon and Achilles, and all the intrigue that goes on, and I preface it with the apple of discord and the judgment of Paris on Mount Ida. So by the time they've heard this, they have characters and they have mental images at work in their minds, which some of the students have reported continue to be animated as if they have an inner motion picture going when they delve into the actual text. So it contextualizes it for them.
Yeah, so you're catalytic with the book in a way.
I'm certainly using modern language and music and character voices. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've created a digital game, and I know that storytelling's involved. Would you mind telling people about that? And also, I'm not sure if Maria is aware of it.
Think of the different sorts of storytelling that there are. I offered you an oral presentation, and that's probably, if you look back into prehistory, the earliest form of the telling of a story. The idea, of course, being that you, the listener, have a chance to create your own mental imagery from the story and hopefully be entertained. And then you have, 5,000 years ago, you have the first hieroglyphic languages. You have that transformation of the utterance into the symbol, whether it's in Arabic later or whether it is cuneiform early languages or hieroglyphics. So there was this interesting transitional period where the spoken utterance was made writ. And then, of course, you had the advent of film, which again revolutionized the storyteller's art. Then you had the introduction of the interactive digital game, which I would submit to you is even more of a revolution of the storyteller's art. And I'd love to come back to whether, if you play a digital game, whether what you've experienced as a first-person player is a story, or is it something else? I'd be very interested in your opinions on that as well. And so then, finally, we've arrived at a point where what we're trying to do is to create a sort of story game where it's called an augmented reality game, where you're not only playing with something that's coming from a machine that you're listening to, you're also imagining a story that you're a part of, and you're using your 5 senses, in this case, a fine art museum, and examining works of art, so that there is another space in which to experience the story. And it's this sort of interesting multiform space where part of it is the real world. That's where the augmented reality definition of gameplay comes from. And then there's also the learning of fine art, the figuring of clues, and then the feeling as if you're immersed in an adventure. And I don't know whether that is a story or not either, but it's certainly a narrative-driven experience.
And this is called The Vanishers?
It's called The Vanishers, yes.
And will it be across the country in museums now?
Well, we're hopeful of that. We are presenting it to museums. We tested it at the Peabody Essex Museum, developed it with them and tested it there, and it worked quite well.
Okay. So Maria, I was wondering from Enchanted Hunters, if I understood correctly, Marshall McLuhan was worried that print might lead to isolation. Is that right? Or I might have gotten it wrong. But I wondered if you thought he might be reassured by book clubs as a social phenomenon.
Oh, definitely. And all the communities that are formed around books, around reading. Harry Potter, look what that has done. I mean, children talk to each other about their reading experience. I noticed that the freshmen in my classes bond with each other by talking about the Harry Potter books or the films, and they go see the films together. So there are these communities created by books, and they'll continue to be created. Steve Johnson tells us that reading is just such a scripted and choreographed experience, and it's in isolation. But it's true, you may be alone with the book for a while, but then you always go out and talk about it. It also becomes part of your identity. So even if you're not talking about the book, there are bits and pieces of it there that you've internalized that you then take to the outside world, to your relationships with real people. I sometimes think the characters I encounter in books are more real. I know their minds better than the people that I know in real life. Yeah, I can read their minds and get inside their heads.
And I was thinking about the storytelling versus book reading that you were mentioning, and maybe you could both comment on this, but James Dale, I think, did all the Harry Potter books, and he just read the stories, but in different voices, and he's very talented, and he captures you in a way. But I found my mind wandering when I listened, but I never found my mind wandering when I listened to a storyteller. And Odds has a theory about why that might be. I wonder if you could both comment on why storytelling might grip in a better way, like superglue, than an actor reading every word of a text.
Well, once in a workshop, a teacher told me a story about her students when she had gone from reading a book to telling a story. And they said, "Oh, please read another book from your face." And that stuck with me for years. I think that there's something about when the storyteller is bringing forth language that is an elemental, sort of an elemental fire to witness. Hopefully it is. And how many of you can read, I'll ask you a question in the audience, without hearing a little voice in your mind, a little facsimile of your own voice, particularly when you begin to read? How many of you can read without hearing a voice? All right. You're not alone. Just about everyone, with the small percentage of people who will say, "I just go directly from those word symbols on the page to mental imagery. It's direct projection." But for all of you at least, it seems that storytelling needs to be taking place, even if it's your own inner voice telling you the story. It's taking place, even in the act of reading. And my theory is that going back to the advent of language and the utterance, that part of our brain, the earlier part of our brain, is wired for the utterance. Even babies in the third trimester in the womb will twitch in very predictable ways when the phonemes, the 50-some-odd phonemes of language are beamed in to where they are. And scientists have actually watched them, sort of hardwiring for the utterances of human speech. Think how many, many millennia piled back into time, people simply uttered to one another rather than had the written word. So I think evolutionarily it makes good sense that there's an ancient part of the brain that waits for the voice, as I think all of you might have just attested to by the fact that you hear your own as you read. I think it's just a biophysical fossil, sort of the way the fight or flight response might be considered a biophysical fossil.
Before Philip Pullman became a successful writer, the author of His Dark Materials, he was a school teacher, and he used to read to his students. What he discovered was they were all falling asleep. They weren't paying attention. So he started telling them the story of the Odyssey. And it was, I think, that experience that taught him about the rhythms of words, of stories, that enabled him to become a writer. So there's this odd way in which, I think of Salman Rushdie, who tells us that watching the MGM film, The Wizard of Oz, made him a writer. And I do think that there's something extraordinary about Pullman's use of line. There is a sense that he is telling you this story. You can almost visualize him telling the story. But how much of a role do you think music plays in, because I think that is so important in your presentation, the not just the acoustical, but the visual effect of you playing.
I cannot answer that, other than it's the only way that I know how to tell stories. I just love music and find that also watching The Wizard of Oz as a little boy, I think it made me want to be a storyteller who added music to the story. I don't know whether for some people it's a distraction. For others, it's an enhancement. It's a very individual sort of question to ask someone. But I just enjoy running the two muses simultaneously. It's really fun.
So I'd like you both to also comment. It seems to me when reading is taught at elementary school, there's no component of storytelling. You know, when you start to learn to read in first grade or kindergarten to first grade, I wondered if it might enhance learning to read if storytelling were somehow worked into the educational process. And then in thinking about that, I wondered if show and tell might be children's initiation into storytelling, but that would not then be applied to learning to read, but more to perhaps social interaction.
Oh, well, I'm a great believer in show and tell, and as you know, as I heard you speak, I immediately thought of that experience, flash back to grade school and the terror of bringing in an object and having to talk about it. But you notice that I did a little show and tell, and maybe there is something reassuring. Once you've become accustomed to that mode through the school experience, it sort of stays with you. I mean, I was just use that phrase, making something out of nothing, but maybe occasionally you need something to create a story, some little talisman, or it can be almost nothing like that cardboard box. But it's nice for those of us who are not the professionals to hold on to something. And
I think there's a great yawning gulf in American education. I think storytelling should be central to the early literacy experience. I know that I've worked with a lot of people who are in Steiner schools, Rudolf Steiner schools, Waldorf schools, and storytelling is a key, central, omnipresent form of education. And I think, and I don't know that would substitute for sort of a broad-based American education, but I think at some point there would be a place where children, if they could learn to stand up and speak and tell a story from beginning, middle to the end, all through the rest of their lives, they would have that ability to call forth their thoughts and to imagine, particularly. We haven't really talked much about the imaginative act and what that may well be sort of waffled nowadays by digital experience. You very kindly sent me a very interesting book called iBrain. It was about the cognitive rewiring of even people my age who, for the very first time, have gotten a chance to Google something. And what they found is that at first it was very odd for them. But these would be called digital immigrants as opposed to digital natives. And the digital immigrants, persons who came to the computer experience not from birth. And we're a vanishing breed because it will very soon be, once this generation has passed it, everyone will be digital natives. They will have grown up doing this, being in constant communication with all manner of people and the world. And then you have Kurzweil and the singularity where we'll have chips in our brain and we can be online constantly. But that may or may not happen. But I think that there's a question to be asked, which is, what is the value of the natural imaginative act? And is that, I know it's not gone because perform for modern kids all the time, and they listen and they're able to imagine. But is it in danger of just being never accessed and atrophying slightly, just because of the mode in which stories are being delivered? What do you think?
Well, I'm more interested in that communication issue, actually, because I think there are, storytellers, it takes a special gift, a talent, to have that. Not everyone has that kind of imagination. They may have other types of ways of applying their imagination. But it seems to me in an age of cyber intimacy, where so many of your relationships are mediated, they're not direct, that somehow exchanging stories learning how to tell your story, even if you don't do it with the kinds of electrifying effects that you use, or if you aren't the greatest storyteller, it's just so important getting to that. And the storytellers, I think, inspire us, but I don't think that everyone has that kind of gift. It's true that they could develop it, but I doubt that they, just as many people will never learn how to play the harp.
And yet, it's expected of all children to learn how to read and to comprehend.
Yeah.
So I think that they're close. But I agree with you. I'm in a very, very sort of odd case in the storytelling field, in that the music is there. But and most storytellers will not use music, and I think that it's just a stylistic approach. But I don't know. Back to the nature of imagination, particularly in the act of Googling and the rewiring of the brain. I'm curious. What do you think? Does anyone have a thought, or does anyone really know a lot about this who'd be willing to share their knowledge with us about it? Because it's a question that certainly I have.
I think there are people who have studied this and who are suggesting that there is a rewiring of the brain when information is accessed in a fashion that is different from linear narration, when you start from a central point and you can jump out into a variety of different places, much like the Google list, that may take you by a circuitous route back to the place you would have got to very quickly by narration, or vice versa. There are people who are looking at these questions, and I think that there is a difference. They posit that there is a difference, much like you posit there is a difference, and there's probably a lot more research to be done before anybody's really certain what happens. But I'd like to ask you both a question, and I'm sorry I'm jumping in here, but I'm here, so I'm going to ask this question. And that is about the satisfaction that narrative provides. There's something very satisfying about hearing, let me tell you a story. No matter what you're doing, you will sit, your audience's ears will perk up. Your own ears will perk up if instead of getting a list of facts, you're going to get a story with a beginning, as you said, and a middle and an end. And even if we can't all become storytellers, as hearers, as learners, as listeners, as readers, I think we all appreciate that way of organizing information that narrative provides. And I wonder if you would comment on that, and particularly in light of the way information can be provided in the electronic age, which is very different from the traditional ordering that narration provides.
Well, should I begin? That's a tall order. I think there's something about narrative that creates the desire to know more. What happened next? And then, if it's a good story, why did that happen? And that's why stories seem to me so important for children. In many children's books, you begin with the bored child, the child with nothing to do. That's a terrible tragedy. The idea that the child is not engaged by the environment and is sitting by the riverbank, falling asleep because the book that Alice in Wonderland is, the book that Alice is reading, has no pictures or conversations. So there's the bored child. And a good story that awakens intellectual curiosity is so important, because one book leads to another. And I should modify one thing that I said, and that is, you know, your storytelling, there is a certain contagious quality to storytelling. And when I showed that CD and described the experience of communicating the story that you told to the students, in the middle of that, I did something. I'm not at all a storyteller, but I was so inspired by your story that I began to tell it, you know, and look what happened. And you know, it was almost as if the muse, a very weak muse, a pale imitation, had inspired me, because I had been so moved by the story. So, you know, it's not only that the books, wonderful stories, arouse curiosity, what happens next and why, but also they create a kind of mimetic, well, I shouldn't call it mimetic, but the desire to imitate. I want to write something or tell something that is as sensational and that will move you, that will really reach your heart and soul.
I go back to the question of whether in this latest story delivery system, terrifying words, aren't they? The digital game, whether a story that you experience as you are playing a first-person game of some sort is a story. I was reading, refreshing my thoughts about Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist's tracking of what he called the monomyth, with 17 different stages that seem to inform not so much even a fairy tale, but the sort of the more mythic side of stories, the Odyssey, the large Gilgamesh, great old ancient ponderous tales. And each of them has, you have the call to adventure, then the hero goes off, then there's the descent usually into the underworld or the belly of the beast. Then you emerge, then you meet the beautiful, the woman who is either the seductress, but she's also the earth. And then you move through all these various interesting and wondrous steps that are part of at least Campbell's sort of scansion across the mythic. And what I wonder about is whether in modern video games, whether the designers have built those sorts of pulses in. And I haven't played enough of them to know, but I would think that having those pulses built in there would be very, very important to the player. You have, for the first time in history, instead of, oh, I'm reading about this great hero, and I'm vicariously identifying with this great hero, you have now, I am this great hero. I am in the eyes of this great hero, and I'm being told by the game that I am indeed this great hero. And I think there's a very interesting shift there that I don't know is precedented at all, and we'll see what develops.
I guess in terms of your idea about teaching, or not really teaching, but accessing imagination and maybe helping it develop, and the question would be, does everybody have imagination? And if so, then how come they're not using it? And I'm wondering then, Maria, with what you were addressing, is maybe the question of why shouldn't be answered. Maybe if the reader is left with an unanswered question, then they have to tug on their imagination. So maybe sequels squash imagination. So The Giver was followed by 2 other books, and The Giver ends with a little boy rescuing an infant, and you don't know if they're going to make it or freeze to death. And you find out in the 3rd book. Why? Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe we'd all be better for using our own minds.
Well, you can always create the 4th book, I would say. I mean, there's never the great thing about narrative is it really doesn't, even the happily ever after of fairy tales, there's always a sequel. There's, well, what happened then? And, in fact, Bluebeard is the story of what happens after the happily ever after. That's one possibility, but then there are other sequels. So I don't worry about that, and maybe, in a way we should distinguish between, say, literary imagination and curiosity and other types of imagination. But I wonder if there are any other storytellers in the audience. Are there